Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. Today, we've got Dr. Helen Petrie, who's a professor emerita in human-computer interaction in computer science at the University of York. And she has degrees in both psychology and computer science. And her research focus has been on designing and evaluating new technologies, especially for people with disabilities and older adults. She has a number of awards and working groups she's been a part of, but today she's going to be talking to us about getting older people involved in the process of designing technologies that they both need and want to use. So if you guys have any questions or other things that you'd like to ask, feel free to put them in the Q&A section. And then at the end, we'll probably address all of those and possibly give you guys a chance to talk on your microphone as well when we get to that point. But in the meantime, Helen, feel free to go ahead and take it away.
Right. Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's 5 o'clock in London, England, and I know it's first thing in the morning for you. So I hope you're having a cup of coffee to keep yourself awake. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about myself, because I've had a very kind of circuitous route through my career, which I think is a bit interesting to people, that where you are now may not be where you end up, but you can have an interesting time on the route. And then I'm going to talk about some different frameworks that have been developed for how you can involve older and disabled people in developing either new technologies, what I call mainstream technologies, technologies for everybody, but you want them to be accessible to as many people as possible. But I've also worked on assistive technologies, technologies which particularly help older or disabled people overcome problems they face in life. And I'm going to talk about a case study about that towards the end of the talk. So it's actually a case study that's more about people who are blind rather than older people in general. But as you'll see as we go along, I think it's a good case study for illustrating how we work with people with disabilities or older people. So it applies absolutely equally to older people as well. And it is actually rather old research, but I thought it's the nicest example I have where we went through the whole process, and it was a very successful project. So I'll come back to that later. So a little bit about myself. I'm from Australia originally. I hope you can understand my accent okay, because I grew up partly in Switzerland, and I've lived in France and Sweden. I was a professor in Sweden for a while. Interestingly, I went to university when I was 21. I worked as a secretary first, and I wanted to study computer science because I wanted to be a scientist. And computer science seemed to be the really, the coming thing. And I absolutely hated it. And I didn't really understand what it was all about, which I have to say, I think was partly due to rather poor teaching at the time. So I swapped to psychology, and I absolutely love psychology. I'm interested in people. I'm interested in what makes people tick. And because I traveled around quite a lot, I had the opportunity then to move to the UK, to England, and I did a PhD in psychology in London, where I am now, but where I don't live anymore. And as part of my PhD, I worked as what in England is called a graduate teaching assistant. I think you have something very similar in the States. And because I was this scientific type of person, I was asked to be the graduate teaching assistant for statistics. Psychologists tend not to be great at statistics. And that was really interesting. And then I got my first job lecturing at the University of Sussex in England. And again, I was asked to teach statistics to psychology students. And I got really interested in the fact that psychology students were not very good with statistics, and they weren't very good with computers. And at that stage, we had to do our statistics on big mainframe computers. And I began to think, well, why are they so scared of computers, and why are the computers so hard for people to use? And in those days, I'm talking just before the graphical user interface revolution, the students had to use a command line system. It had to be absolutely precise. It did not play to the strengths of human beings. So I started to look at this relatively new field, human-computer interaction, and I found it a bit dry. It wasn't really telling me why people found things hard. It was lots of mathematical models. And then I thought, well, maybe I don't understand the computing, and I'm going to have another go at this computing thing, because I'm a stubborn kind of person, and I always regretted that I'd given up on computing. So I went and I did a master's in computer science. I didn't tell anyone I had a PhD in psychology, but eventually my fellow students found out and thought I was completely mad. But this time I understood why I wanted to know this stuff, and I really loved computer science, and I did lots of programming and really loved that. But I really wanted to combine my computing and my psychology and look at why do people find computers so hard and how can we make them better. And then quite by chance, I was walking down a corridor at the university and I saw this sign for the Royal National Institute for Blind People, which is the main charity for blind people in England. And they wanted a psychologist to look at how blind people could use computers. And I thought, oh, I didn't know blind people could use computers, which is what I've been doing ever since. To this day, I don't know why they thought they wanted a psychologist, but it turned out to be a really good move. I worked for the Royal National Institute for Blind People for 2 years, and then I went back into the university world, and I've done research on this area ever since, and I feel very passionate about it. I find it really interesting as a challenge. I tell people, you know, it's not about charity and helping people who have problems. It's an interesting intellectual challenge as well as helping people. So I've been doing that all of my academic life. So that's how I've got to where I am today. I've done lots of international projects and people seem to like what I do. I often feel I'm the mediator between the real computer scientists and the people we're trying to help, the people with disabilities and the older people, because I kind of talk both languages now. So when I started, the big thing of how you involve people with disabilities or older people in research was called user-centered design. And please note that I've changed my spelling to American spelling for you. I realized you might be confused by our British spelling. So it's really hard to find a perfect diagram about user-centered design because it's always a bit more complicated, but this was quite a good one I found a few days ago. So the idea of user-centered design is you start from the kind of top of this diagram where it says analysis, and you try and understand what problem are the users having, or I always call them the users, the people, the citizens, whatever you'd like to call them, but what problem are they having which we could use technology to improve their situation? We often talk about improving their quality of life. So that would be an assistive technology. Or is there a technology that's coming along that people will want to or need to use that may be difficult for blind people or older people to use, and we should be looking at how to make it accessible. So we call that accessibility. And it's interesting, I don't know what it's been like in the States, but in the pandemic in the UK, there has been a sudden great use of QR codes. Now, QR codes have been around for quite a long time and were used occasionally. And my memory was they never seemed to work really well. But suddenly in the pandemic, when we were going in anywhere we went, we had to show a QR code on our phone. And then if we were going to a restaurant or a cafe, the waiter would have their phone with an app on it and would read our QR code, which showed that we were vaccinated. And also a lot of restaurants have now started putting their menus on the web, so they don't have to have a physical menu that is people are going to touch and possibly put COVID germs on. So you have a QR code on your table and you read the QR code. And that's all very well, but what if you don't have a smartphone because you're an elderly person? And what if you're blind? How do you find the QR code? How do you align the QR code? No one seems to have thought about the accessibility. So that's really excluding quite a lot of people. So you start by trying to understand what's the problem. And then if you're kind of technical people like us, you start thinking about, well, what are the solutions going to be? So we go to conception of, okay, perhaps we can use the case study I'm going to talk about later, used GIS, graphical information systems, and GPS, the satellite system for blind people. So then you start designing something, knowing what your user group want and need, and also knowing the capabilities and preferences of the user group. And preferences is also important, and I'll come back to that in my case study. And then you evaluate that. Is it going to work? You test it in different ways. And you'll notice here we've got arrows going backwards and forwards. So this is where we can go round and round trying things out. Maybe the first thing we try doesn't work, or we've got several ideas and we try both of them out to find out which works best, which people prefer, until, as I always say, you either run out of time, you run out of money, or in very rare cases, you find a solution that seems to be the optimal one. So you kind of exit from this cycle of design. And in fact, a very famous HCI person, Jacob Nielsen, he, in one of his early projects, talked about the fact that he went around this cycle of design and evaluation 20 times before he came to a solution he was satisfied with. And given that he's a big guru in HCI, I always say, well, if Jacob Nielsen can do it 20 times, I usually go around 3 times. So I think I'm doing pretty well there. So that's the framework we kind of started off with. And it is the framework that I still use and will show you in my case study. But I wanted to talk about a couple of other ideas that are important as well. Oops. Right. Oh, sorry. First, before I talk about that, I just wanted to talk, that's the framework. And then we have a whole lot of methods that we can deploy within that framework at different times. And when I'm teaching human-computer interaction to students, I think this becomes quite confusing initially, because it's not that at the first stage you use this method and then you use this method and then you use another method. There's I call it a toolbox of different methods that you have, and you can deploy them, you can use them at different times, depending on what you need to know at that point. And it does take a certain amount of experience and confidence to think, okay, what we need to do now is this. So I'll just give you some illustrations here. when you're at that first stage of understanding what the users might need and what they'd like, we talk about needs and wishes, because a lot of technology is just about what people need, not what they wish. I think we need to get to what people really wish. So you might do questionnaires if your user group is used to doing questionnaires. I find often with older people, they're not very interested in doing questionnaires. It's a bit of a boring exercise. You can get a lot of information from a lot of people, but it tends to be what I'd call rather shallow information. You know, they're not going to sit there and answer in detail. If you want to get in-depth information about people's lives, and you might need to tease out from them a bit what the problems are, then you need to do either interviews or possibly focus groups, discussion groups. And there are pros and cons of doing individual interviews versus focus groups. And then there are some funny things that we've developed specifically in HCI. There's something called a probe, where you would give someone something like what you're planning to develop, and in a playful way, get them to try it out to see how they react to it, to see whether they, for example, would they find it acceptable? Would they find it interesting? Often I find more technical people want to just observe people, or will come later log their data on apps and things. And that's not really particularly useful, because you want to get inside people's heads. You want to find out what they're thinking, what do they want, what do they need. So if you observe people, you tend to need to combine that with interviews or other ways of finding out what people think. And you can use all that information to develop personas, or possibly the proper plural is personae, I'm not sure, which is where you kind of try and condense all your information into a number of ideal users or typical users. So for example, you might have older people who are interested in technology and want to use it. Other older people may be rather suspicious, skeptical of technology and not want to use it. So you develop a set of what are the different types of people we're designing for, and you can think about those user stories, as it were, as a way of helping you think through the design. And then when you get through to the evaluation stage, we tend to think of there being two types of evaluation. And the first type we call formative evaluation. And that's where you haven't got a whole system yet. You haven't got an app or anything, but you've got ideas and you want to try out ideas before you commit yourself to lots of programming, for example. And you can do little studies in the lab. You can bring people into the lab and get them to try things out. And particularly what I like to do and have done a lot of is I don't want to commit my team to programming anything yet. So we have a technique called the Wizard of Oz, which is named after the film, which I have to say I have never seen. But in the film, The Wizard of Oz, the wizard is behind a curtain and people think he's very powerful, but then the curtain comes back and he's just a little old man. So he's not powerful at all. So in a Wizard of Oz study, you pretend to be the computer. And you can either tell people, I'm just going to show you what it would be like, and you can have rough sketches, or as you'll see in my case study, we talked and told people the kind of messages the system would give them, and you see how they react, but you haven't programmed anything. And I find that's a really powerful thing. And actually, I prefer to tell people, because then they think it's fun. It becomes an interesting exercise, and they're working with you to develop the system. And the other technique we use, which is really useful and can be used in different ways is what we call think aloud protocols, or formally they're called verbal protocols. And this helps you get inside people's heads. So you'll ask people to use something, be it a Wizard of Oz or a real system, and talk through, what are you trying to do? What are you thinking? What's problematic? What do you like? And you can either do this where they talk it through as they're doing it, or if that can become a bit difficult if it's too complicated. It's also a bit difficult if you have blind people who use screen readers, because you can't listen to them and the screen reader at the same time. So you can do it retrospectively. You video them, and then you both work through the video, and they tell you what they were doing. And actually, I found this works really well with older people. And I thought maybe the cognitive load, the mental strain for older people to do it while they were doing the task would be a bit much. So we did a study where we compared older people doing it during the task or after the task. And actually, older people prefer doing it during the task. And one person said to me, well, I talk to myself all the time now to make sure I'm on track. So you're actually just asking me to do what I do all the time. So now I say to older people, okay, I want you to talk me through this. You may do this when you're doing tasks at home. So again, it's bringing the users with you into the process, which I'll come to again in a minute. And then when you've really got something more kind of a working system, then we do what we call summative evaluation. We've got the sum of the system now. So again, we would do all the same kinds of methods. We could evaluate it in the lab. In York, we have a whole apartment with a living room, a kitchen, and a bedroom set up. So we can bring people in, but they're in a home-like environment. And I think you have facilities like that. We might get them to do a think aloud, or we might go out into the field. We're just starting a project that got delayed because of the pandemic, of giving older people small robots to have at home. So we're giving them the robot for a month, and it does various things for them, and we will interview them once a week. You could give them questionnaires. Again, I don't particularly go for that as a good method. There's an interesting method called the experience sampling method, where you send people, nowadays you send people a text on their mobile phone 5 to 7 times a day and say, what are you doing? How are you feeling? Again, that works really well for certain kinds of things. If you're studying something that people are doing very often, that's going to be really good. If the robot's only going to be used a couple of times a day, that's not going to work. And again, in this instance, you might log, we might well log how much they use the robot by programming the robot to record use. But I would want to combine that with some kind of insight into what they feel. So I might go through the log and say, okay, so on Tuesday, you were using the robot about 10 o'clock in the morning. Do you remember that? It looks as if you were asking it for the weather report, and use that as a way of getting people to remember in detail what they were using it for. And then you can ask, did it work well? Was it successful? Did you like it? Etc., etc. So you've got this whole suite of methods that you can use. So that's user-centered design. Now, that then merges as we move from older or disabled people that we kind of study, we get information about them. But when I do it, I try and bring them into the process. And that's really called participatory design. And I would see a continuum from just kind of looking what I'd call the old-fashioned psychology way, the people are the subjects and I'm studying them, as opposed to the people I'm working with are co-designers. We're solving this problem together. And I've had some great instances where it's one of the older people who's come up with, well, you could do it this way. And I think, yes, that's brilliant. We'll do it this way. And I always try and acknowledge that when I write about my research, that it wasn't my idea, it was one of the users' ideas. So at the extremes, you could say user-centered design is studying the users, and participatory design is giving the users decision-making powers over what happens. And sometimes people, of course, don't want to have that decision-making power. They say, well, you're the expert, you're the computer scientist or the psychologist, you tell us what's going to be best. So I think you want to mix it up. There's a whole interesting history about user-centered design came from basically from the United States, and participatory design came from Scandinavia. And user-centered design came from HCI and psychology and computer science, whereas participatory design came from political science and work participation. But that's a kind of long story. I think the important thing is I do regularly come across people who have a good idea for technology that they think will help disabled or older people, but they don't look at, is that a problem that actually needs to be solved? Is this something that older people want help with, rather than just, here's a cool technology, we can solve a problem with it. So, for example, in Britain, we now have in our supermarkets, you don't have to go to a checkout with the human being. You can have a handheld device that you go around the supermarket, you scan, and then you go to a machine and you pay. So you never have to interact with a human being. The supermarkets, of course, would love that because it's less expense for them. Older people think it's terrible because they don't get to have a chat with the person at the checkout, which is part of their daily routine. So I'd call that technology push, that yes, it's a good technology solution, but it's actually not what people wish. And it's not really what people need at the moment, but it may save money. So I want to move at least towards the participatory design end of this continuum. Then there's another, another framework or philosophy, which has a lot of different terms. Sometimes it's called inclusive design, universal design. In Europe, it's often called design for all. They had a go at calling it universal usability, and sometimes designing for accessibility. I think a lot of these terms actually scared computer scientists and developers, because they seem to suggest that we're going to have to create technologies that everyone can use. So universal design suggests everyone, however old, however disabled, will be able to use a new technology. And I do quite a lot of training of web developers, and they get quite worried that I'm trying to tell them that their website is going to have to be used by everybody. And that's not what it means. First of all, quite a lot of people with disabilities come with their own assistive technology, which will solve a lot of the problems for them. And there are some groups of people who have very severe disabilities that it's not reasonable. In Europe, we have this concept of a reasonable adjustment that we can ask people to make. So inclusive design really means we're trying to make things that include as many people as is reasonable. Now this comes, hang on, have I missed a slide? Yes. This comes from a very architecture and product design perspective. So it's interesting the way different disciplines have approached this topic in the same way, but have come up with different ways of dealing with it. Because to me, as a psychologist by training who's moved into computer science, this is very much about standards. I think I've lost a slide which says this, but it's okay, I'll just tell you. Rather than actually going to the people, you know, as I said right at the beginning, I'm interested in the people. I want to go and talk to the people and understand them. This approach is more about having standards. And I understand that architects and people who build bridges and things, you need standards to work to. But I don't think that gets you all the way. So here's a definition of universal design. And there's a really good website from Ireland, as it happens, the Irish Centre for Excellence in Universal Design, where they have a lot of great information about this approach. And you can see, I think, from their definition that they're coming from a very different perspective. So they say that universal design is the design and composition of an environment that can be accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible. I'd say that, you know, to the reason, that's the reasonableness, by all people, regardless of their age, size, or ability or disability. An environment or any building product or service in that environment should be designed to meet the needs of all people who wish to use it. So I think that's it's very aspirational, but it sums up a lot of things. But this emphasis is on the environment, which is a good inspiration for us. So they have come up with these 7 principles of universal design. So this is this kind of standards approach. I'm just going to pick out a couple of the principles to talk about. And you can go to the website and there's a really interesting discussion of them. So the principles in brief are equitable use, flexibility in use, simple and intuitive use, perceptible information, tolerance for error, low physical effort, and size and space for approach and use. It's very much to do with the environment. Some of these principles are actually principles we've had in HCI for a long time as well, which is interesting. So just as an example, equitable use is that the design is useful and marketable. I love that, marketable, to people with diverse abilities. And this is interesting. 1A is to provide the same means of use for all users, identical wherever possible, equivalent when not. I actually think that's really important, that my experience with disabled and older people is a lot of people who design things say, well, we'll make something, you know, separate for people who are blind or for older people. And that's not a good solution in the long run, unless there's no other way around it, because then in effect, you're putting people in a ghetto where they have their own system. They then can't collaborate necessarily with people who are using a different system. Is it going to be kept up to date in the same way? So that blends very nicely into 1B, which is avoid segregating or stigmatizing any users. So these are good principles, but they're pretty abstract. And then this Irish Centre has tried to illustrate these principles to make them concrete, which I think is really important. And this is a very famous example that you come across in inclusive design or in universal design. It isn't about a digital system, but I think it's worth knowing about. So there's been a lot of effort to help wheelchair users by removing steps and uneven surfaces where they're not necessary, so that, for example, this is obviously a train of some kind, so it's easier for a wheelchair user to access the service, the train. This is a big problem in where I live in England, because we have a lot of old buildings with steps. It can be very difficult to do this, but there are some very beautiful examples where people put very beautiful ramps as opposed to ugly ramps. Now, the inclusive principle here is that this actually helps a lot of other people who are not disabled particularly. So here's a lady with a small child in a pusher, we'd call that in England, and she's able to access the train much more easily now because it's level. So one of the good things about universal design or inclusive design is if you design for the people who have particular difficulties, you almost inevitably create designs that are good for everybody. So I call that the usability benefit, that you're improving the world for everybody. Another good one. Sorry, I jumped there. This is a really good one for digital technologies, and that is that the information should be perceptible to the broadest possible range of people. So if you think of information that is in text, will that be accessible to people who are visually impaired? If it's in audio, will it be perceptible to people who are hearing impaired? With elderly people, you often get people who have some hearing loss and some visual loss, so they can work sometimes with speech and sometimes with text, and if you give them both, they tend to do better. So if you provide information in different modalities, you're improving things for a whole lot of people in a whole lot of ways. And there's a very nice example on the left here, which is from a public transit system in Japan. So you've got the fact that you may have people who don't understand the Japanese-based language, that they may not understand the character system. We've got people who may not understand language at all. So in fact, there's triple coding here. No, there's 4 times coding. So each line has a color. Each line has a particular symbol. So if you've got a cognitive impairment and you don't use written language at all, you can go by the symbol. And then you've got the text in both Japanese and in the Latin script. So if you are a language user, but you don't understand the Japanese, you've got a possibility. And yet it's very aesthetically pleasing and elegant. You know, it's not taking up that much more room than the signs, and it's giving people many chances to understand it. So I think that's a really great example. And that kind of example we can use a lot in digital technologies, of not just coding things in one way. For example, about 10% of men in populations of European origin have some color vision impairment. So you don't want to use only red and green. I noticed, for example, on Zoom, I have a little bar at the top and it's red versus green. I'm not quite sure what it's trying to tell me with the red and the green, to be honest, but it's encoding something. In fact, it's the stop and the share. So they have double coded it. I'll let them off for that one, but often you find things that are just red and green, and that's really not very good. Now on the right is a more subtle example of showing where the entrances to the train doors are by lighting them, as well as having the gates, but it's the one on the left I really love. So I'm going to skip forward. There are other examples, and I do recommend you go and have a look at that website because it's really easy and interesting reading. I just wanted to mention a completely different thing, which I wasn't quite sure where it fitted in to the different frameworks. And it is quite controversial in some ways that one thing some people think is a good idea, and I think is a reasonable idea, is that particularly if we're working with older people and you're a young, fit, active person, understanding what it's like to be older is quite difficult. And now that I'm getting older, I'm beginning to understand this. So very interestingly, two car companies, Ford and in the States and Nissan in Japan, about the same time, seem to come up with the same idea of creating a suit for their young engineers who are designing cars to physically experience what it's like to be older. And you can see in the image, you wear glasses to blur your vision a bit. You've got lots of stuff on your body that makes it harder to flex. And because it's to do with driving, they actually put heavy weights on their feet and also particularly make it harder to move your hands. So I know particularly about the Ford experience that they used this to design the Ford Focus car because they wanted a car that was particularly suited for older drivers and older passengers. So the engineers wore these suits and got in and out of cars and drove cars. And the result was the Ford Focus, which was one of the most popular Ford cars Ford ever marketed in Europe. And the marketing people would not let them advertise this as a universally or inclusive design car. They said, no, that's going to put people off. But it was very successful and people said it was very comfortable and easy to drive and easy to get in and out of, et cetera, et cetera. So some disabled people, in particular disabled activists, don't like this idea because they would say, well, you can take off the suit. You don't have to live with it all your life. And it's not really the same as being disabled or being older, which I have some sympathy with. But I also think it's really useful. If you bear that in mind, that does give you insight into what it's like. Now, this suit, you can buy it, I believe, but it's extremely expensive. And at York, with one of my postdoc students, we developed the budget version, the budget suit. So we bought lots of, and I'll send you a little handout about this. We bought lots of cheap glasses at the supermarket and we put boot polish, shoe polish, and Vaseline to simulate different visual conditions. We get people to put buttons on all of their fingers and then several layers of rubber gloves, and that makes it much harder to move your fingers, which is interesting. And they're the two things that we find really useful. We then get our students to try and use each other's mobile phones, their smartphones, and they find it really amazingly difficult. And you could also put on headphones. So this is a very budget way, and it's really great for the students to try this out and see what it's like. So I recommend this, and I'll send you our exercises. So I want to get onto my case study because time's running out. So this case study was a project called MOBIC, which was Mobility for Blind and Elderly Persons Interacting with Computers, which is not a terribly informative name. And it was funded by the European Union, who fund a lot of our research on assistive technology and technology for older people. And it included people from the UK, Germany, and Sweden. Now, this was about going back to the early noughties. So we were trying to develop a travel planning system for blind, partially sighted and older people so that they could use a geographic information system, what we would now think of as Google Maps, to be honest, but this was before Google Maps was a commercial product, to plan where they were going to go. That would then download a route that they'd planned into a laptop computer we had to use, which they would then take with them, and it would guide them with verbal messages. So it's a bit like the kind of system we now have in cars with sat-nav, but this was for pedestrians, which posed all kinds of interesting problems to do with safety and the scale of the information. And we were actually the first project in the world to try this. Or there are lots of commercial products, particularly for blind people now, that do this. But I want to illustrate how we did this using that user-centered design framework. So the first thing was we really wanted to understand what problems do blind and partially sighted people, I'm going to concentrate on the blind and partially sighted people, to be honest, although we did talk to older people, but what problems did they have that they needed to solve? Because they weren't the problems that we thought they would have, if you see what I mean. So we planned to do 36 in-depth interviews. We actually ended up doing 24, because one of the things you do when you interview people is you keep on analyzing the data as you go. And when we got to the 25th interview, my postdoc researcher said, you know, we're just finding the same things. I think we've found all the problems. So you call that saturation. We felt we had enough then. But we also ran 2 focus groups, because with focus groups, you get people kind of bouncing ideas off on each other. Whereas in interviews, you'll get people more revealing their personal problems that they may not want to discuss in a group. So you get different kinds of information. We did some with older people as well. And then because I didn't know at that point, I'd been working on computer access for blind people, but I didn't know much about mobility. I actually trained as a blind person because I was working for the Royal National Institute for Blind People. I was allowed to do this. I took part of the training. I learned how a blind person uses a long cane. And that was really, really useful. Then I really understood. And there was an interesting little kind of subplot that I did my training on a very sunny day in London, which is quite rare. And I'm slightly photophobic. I don't have very much pigment in my eyes. I'm very pale. So I had thick sunglasses on. I could see that people thought I was blind and I was being trained. And it was really interesting the way people reacted to me. And that to me was the real experience of knowing what it was like to be blind, the way people veered away. People didn't look at me in a very nice way. I thought, okay. The other thing is we read lots of memoirs and autobiographies of blind people to understand their experience. And that's something I really recommend, reading what people have written. Of course, people who write are not necessarily typical. They're probably high achievers, but it was really interesting about the challenges they'd faced. And particularly because some were people who were blind from birth and people who had lost their sight. Everyone thinks there's a huge difference between those 2 groups. It's not nearly as much difference as you might think, and we also interviewed some experts. So we felt then we really understood, and we started formulating ideas. And one of the things we'd learned, particularly from the interviews, was that being aware of your surroundings is really, really important if you're blind. If you can't see where you are, you listen to all the sounds, and you actually also, you feel the surfaces under your feet change, and you smell different things. So people talked, for example, about, I always walked past what in England we'd call a newsagent, a place that sells newspapers, and I knew I was at the newsagent because I could smell the newspapers. So people used amazing cues. So, and people said they didn't want too much auditory information because that would impede them listening to the world around them, because we were thinking this would talk to you all the time, but that obviously wasn't going to work. So we did a study, and I don't think we ever published this, which is such a pity. And we called it the Ambulatory Wizard of Oz. And this is where research becomes such fun. So what we did was we took a big city block in London with a lot of different things, and myself and the postdoc, we spent a whole day walking around, noting everything, noting every difference in the pavement level, where the pedestrian crossings were, where the post box were, where the lamp posts were, where the shops were. A really detailed understanding of that block. And then we recorded messages that a computer system might be able to tell people that we thought would be reasonable. And then we got, I think it was 8 blind people, and we walked around the block with each one saying, at this, so we were the Wizard of Oz, but we had to tell people we were the wizard. There was no way around this, but we'd say, okay, the system could say now, pedestrian crossing to your right, or newsagent to your left, or change of pavement coming up. So we had lots of different messages, and they gave us lots of information. They kept on saying, shorter, shorter, not so much, not so much. So that gave us a good idea of how the system could compose the messages going forward. So that was a formative evaluation. We did a lot of other formative evaluations of what kind of headphones did people want to wear. And again, they were very concerned about, they wanted to still hear the environment, so they didn't want on-ear headphones. They didn't want 2 in-ear headphones. So we got these very advanced bone conducting headphones that sit on your bones, which turned out to be the most uncomfortable things in the entire world, and no one wanted those. So that was dead. So quite a lot of different formative evaluations. And then as we got closer, I'd still call these formative evaluations, we had a clear idea now how the system would work, and we set up a study where we had a simple map and people could plan their route. And then how were they going to do it when they were blind? So could they do it with the cursor movement? And they could. And we then got blind people to draw what they thought the map was and where the landmarks were. Their maps were incomprehensible, but it was clear they could navigate this way. So again, it was another step towards what we needed. So then we did a small summative evaluation. We picked a very quiet place in London, and it was done in Berlin as well, because we were terrified that we were going to be the first people to kill a blind person testing technology as they walked into the traffic. So this time it was the real system. It was picking up the GPS. We were absolutely amazed that it worked. They studied the map, they went out. I walked next to them in case they needed help and asking them to talk me through. So it was another ambulatory think aloud. We had a researcher walking in front to make sure they didn't do anything unsafe, because our ethics committee was absolutely petrified of us doing this. And also that person was next to a researcher who was walking backwards the whole way, who actually videoed the whole thing for us to analyze later, and it worked. So we were really happy. And then we did a bigger trial in of a much more complicated version. We were running out of money and time at that point. We had spent nearly $1 million at this point, but we were pretty proud of what we'd done. And our big success, I'm sorry, I had a photo of this gentleman, but I couldn't find it this week. He had been blinded in the Falklands War, which was very famous in UK, but he'd used maps beforehand in the Navy. And he was just amazed when we gave him an auditory map, because he had no sight from being wounded in the Falklands War, and he found the system very easy to use. We realized that blind people who'd never seen would need much more training, but then sighted people need training in how to use maps. You don't just know how a map works, you have to learn. So we had to explain, this was interesting, we had to explain to blind people who'd never seen, a map is not something that's obvious to a sighted person. You have to learn to use it. So you're going to have to learn to use it as well. So now these systems are very common for blind people, which is great. So that's the whole kind of cycle from understanding the problem, realizing there were many things about how blind people navigate the world that we needed to take into account, going through some little steps to get to the whole system. And it took 3 years, a team of about 20 people, and about $1 million. So it's not cheap. So just very quickly, I wanted to end on personas, and I'll just kind of introduce you to this. As I said before, when you've got all this information from users, it can be hard to kind of keep it all in your mind, and creating personas of the different types of people you're designing for can be very useful. And I think particularly if you're designing for older people, I mean, people say, oh, I don't know how a blind person does something, but people think they know what older people are like because they've got a grandmother or a grandfather. But actually, older people are much more diverse than we think, and particularly because we have lived through the digital revolution. So different cohorts of older people are going to have different knowledge of digital systems. So I've created a set of personas. These are somewhat UK oriented, but probably you can relate to who these people are. And I have based them on the real lives of these people with some elaboration. So for example, this is Liz. She's 95 now. And if she started work in 1944, which in fact she did do, she worked a bit during the war. And if she'd been a secretary, risen to be secretary of, or PA of the CEO of a company, she would have retired at 60 in 1986. Now that was just the beginning of the PC revolution. Very few people in ordinary businesses used computers or digital technologies then. She may have used an electronic typewriter at work, and that's quite a sophisticated piece of technology, but it's not really a digital technology. So throughout her working life until she retired, she wouldn't have had any experience of digital technologies. But she's a pretty bright, sparky lady, and she's got 2 grandsons, Will and Harry, and they're very internet savvy, tech savvy. They've probably taught her about the internet and texting, and she does in fact have an Instagram account and a website, although I'm not convinced she's really using them. So that's one person. And I'll leave you, when you get these slides, to compare this with this gentleman who's now 78, which I can't believe. So he's quite a bit younger than her, but I think he's probably not so interested in technology. I've never seen him tweeting. He's not, in Britain, we'd say probably wasn't the brightest spark in the plug set. So he would be much more resistant to using technology than Liz, even though Liz is a lot older than her. And then you've got this gentleman who's now 60, so he could be called old, but he's been using a PC since 1985. He was only in his early 20s then, so he's not a digital native, but I'd say he's a digital immigrant. He's going to be very comfortable with technology want to continue to use technology as he gets older. So have a think about those different people and the little stories I've told. So thank you very much for listening. I think I'm reasonably in time. I will send you all the slides, and I've actually written a chapter with one of my former postdoc researchers about working with participants, and I'll send you a range of papers on MOBIC and on doing the third age suit exercise. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you. That was a pretty informative talk, and it was kind of interesting to see the different frameworks that you talked about, and kind of the different experiences that you've had using the different frameworks and using the different methodologies, because it was kind of cool to see kind of real world experience with those things,
Yeah.
instead of just talking about them. So I don't think we had any Q&A questions, but Diane did have a couple questions she had sent to me before she had to head out. One of the ones she was wondering about is you talked about using experience sampling, kind of looking at, you know, asking people questions about things and how they feel about them as they're using it. Did you find that there's a trade-off between like how many questions per day or per, you know, per time unit versus like user engagement and burnout, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Like, was there a trade, you know, any rules?
I find you get people who are very enthusiastic, and to do that kind of work, you really need a lot of data.
Right.
In fact, I don't know how the guys who originally developed it were psychologists. I don't know how they managed to get the quantities of data they got. Because I find you ask people, will they do that? And they say, oh, yeah, sure. And I say, you know, it's going to be 5 times a day. I think one of the tricks is to ask just very simple questions, and the same question or easy kind of combinations of questions. So each answer is easy. But even so, I find you get about 3 days of data, 5 days of data, and then it trails off. Yeah. And even when you go back to people, they say, oh, yeah, okay. So, yeah, it's hard to get it to work. In fact, I find I've done it with young people and I've done it with older people. I think it works better with older people, retired people, particularly if you engage them in what you're trying to find out, because they've got a bit more time in their life, and I've got a panel of about 50 people in York, all over the age of 65, and they're kind of interested in my research. So it's easier with them than with young people who've got too many demands and too many notifications coming on WhatsApp and every channel. Yeah, but it is a real challenge. Yeah, I think part of where that question was coming from Diane as well is, so the project, especially that I'm involved in with Apple Watches, we use Apple Watches for tracking sensor data, and we also use ecological momentary assessment, which is you might have run into that, and so we always have this challenging, how many times do we prompt a person per day? How many questions do you ask each time? You know, sometimes we have studies that, you know, will prompt people 4 times a day with like 8 or 9 questions each time, and it's always that risk of that burnout. So, and I've also found what you've talked about, what you were saying about, you know, you have older adults that are more, if you engage them in why you're doing this research and what you're kind of looking at, you know, we get participants are like, oh, I love doing this stuff because it's, you know, I get to explore new things and it's cool to see what you guys are doing about it. And my best example of that was we did a study with very elderly people, mainly in their 90s, who were living in sheltered accommodation. And my PhD student was interviewing them, and she was a lovely young woman, absolutely perfect for interviewing these people. And we'd allowed an hour for the interview. And she came to me and she said, I'm really, really sorry, but these interviews are taking 3 hours. And particularly the elderly ladies are having their hair done at the hairdresser in the sheltered accommodation before I come. And they've got tea and biscuits. And I said, that's fine. If it takes 3 hours and it takes 3 hours because it's important to them. It's an activity for them, but yeah, it's so you've got to modulate your research method to suit the participants.
Right. Exactly. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then the only other question Diane had was just, if there's ways that you've observed to kind of improve older adult adoption of technologies, like, it sounds like from the talk and from just my, understanding in general, there's tons of ways, and it all depends on context, right? But, are there certain things like maybe, because we look a lot at monitoring, cognitive function and health function and things over time with, trying to use technology for that. So maybe, including like fun things like games or some sort of gamification of things with those, health monitoring technologies, or any other kind of maybe.
Yeah, gamification is interesting because I think older people, it's not that they're suspicious of that, but their idea of what is fun is not necessarily the same as what a 30-year-old or an 18-year-old's idea is fun. So they can be a bit, dubious, shall we say, rather than suspicious. Why is it being gamified? So, but I think you do have to balance, and I've noticed this particularly since the pandemic, that if people see the point of how it's helping them or what it's for. So I think the supermarket technology is a good example. And I had the same thing years ago with, I did a project with banks about why weren't older people using the automatic bank machines, and they wanted me to improve the technology. And in the end, I said to them, it's not the technology. Older people want to go into the bank and chat with the person behind the desk, and they've probably known them for 20 years. So they cannot see the point. And we did interviews. They were worried about being mugged. They didn't want to, the advantages, you can get money 24 hours a day. I'm not out after 6 o'clock at night. But in the pandemic, I saw people in their 80s using Zoom, for example, because they could contact people. So I think making clear and being sure that they really want it is really important. On the other hand, I think not quite gamification, but making it interesting and engaging is also important, which may edge into gamification, but not in the same way as for younger people. And that will depend on the user group. I mean, I'm always conscious that my panel of 50 people, they're not all university educated by any means, but they're people who have volunteered to be in research. So they're curious. In fact, one of my postdocs coined this term, the curious public, which is not everybody.
Right.
Yeah. So I think those are the two things I balance up. How can I make it interesting, engaging for them, and it's something that they do want.
Right.
Yeah.
I think those are really good insights, and
and
definitely, I come from the computer science background, but having been involved in this, older adult technology research for so long, I've seen little snippets of that, and so it's nice to kind of get a comprehensive, and kind of a different view on that as well. It's been really useful. So, well,
my other tip is golfers. I'm always telling people, so we got one person, an older gentleman, and we're always looking for new people, because another thing you have to be a bit careful of is people kind of almost become professional participants in your studies. So we're always trying to find new people. And I said, if you've got any friends, he said, oh, well, I'm a member of the local golf club, and most of the people at the golf, I was really surprised, most of the people who golf in York are over 60.
Yeah.
So we're going to do a special project for assistive technology for elderly golfers.
That's great.
And we have our user group ready and waiting to discuss. I don't understand golf at all, so I'm going to have to learn golf, I think, to be able to do this. But it's a good source of people.
Easiest recruitment ever.
Yep, absolutely. They'll be banging down the door.
That's great. Well, thank you for coming and talking to us today. And I definitely really appreciated your insights on things, and I think others did as well. So yeah, thank you. And we'll definitely be in touch more about, especially you mentioned coming to Vancouver. If you're around, we definitely would love to.
Yep, it probably will be. Won't be till later this year, I suspect, given the way the world is. But yeah. And if people have questions, you've got my email address. Just get in touch. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's been really interesting.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good evening.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.